Good evening, this is Gary Kavanagh here on the right side on Grip. I'm afraid today I do not have my friend and colleague Michael Dwyer with me. Actually don't know where Michael is. He's a whimsical man, sometimes he's just gone. So it appears to be tradition that when Michael is gone I will pick a horrible topic and try and defend it to the best of my ability or explain why it's not horrible. But I'm not going to do that this time. Today I'm going to talk about a uncontroversial and easily understood idea. And that idea is this. It is perfectly fair for a company to pay its CEO thousands of times more than the average worker's wage, up to an infinite amount. Do you know when I say this, I'm not saying it is the best thing to do. I'm not saying you should do it. I am saying that if a company wants to pay its CEO some extraordinary figure, they should have every right to do that. And I mean, I could just make that statement. I think it's fairly self-supporting, but that's not really informative. So I will also go through what CEOs are, why they are paid, what they are paid, how much they are paid, why they are paid in that fashion, what an actual company is, what its CEO's responsibility to it is, and basically just why it's a perfectly fair thing. So just on the very basic level for people who don't know, a CEO is a Chief Executive Officer. That would have been a very, very low bar to stumble over if I'd forgotten that. Basically, a Chief Executive or CEO is the most senior officer in charge of managing the organisation. They are generally appointed by a board of directors. The board of directors are put in place by the owners of the company. So in a publicly traded company in which stock, which is basically ownership, is traded publicly, then anyone who owns stock is a partial owner. Obviously some owners are going to be massive, some owners are going to be fractional, but they are the owners. The owners get together generally once a year and they vote who will be on the board of directors. The board of directors is then tasked with overseeing the company's performance and keeping an eye on the CEO. So the CEO will generally report to the board of directors. The board of directors will have, generally speaking, the power to remove the CEO or to replace him with someone else. It can get a bit finicky where the CEO was involved at an earlier stage, or they were able to negotiate certain contracts, or they have partial ownership themselves. But in a general sense, the board can get rid of the CEO. Generally, the board are also the people who will negotiate CEO's pay. So a CEO is basically the person who has responsibility for the company in a general day-to-day sense. He will be blamed if the company does badly, he will be praised if the company does well, and he has to constantly report to the board of directors who can remove him at their leisure, depending on what the contract says. So what is a CEO's actual job? That actually really depends on how you view companies. There are a couple of different ideas of what the actual job of a company is. Probably the largest one is what's called the Friedman Doctrine, or sometimes shareholder doctrine. And basically the Friedman Doctrine comes from the economist Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman said that the responsibility of a company is towards its shareholders, because the shareholders own the company, and therefore the job of the company is to make shareholders money. And that is its only job. It needs to maximize profits so it can maximize returns to shareholders. And that is probably, well, maybe it's slipping now, but it has been one of the most influential theories in business of recent times. So basically under this, the CEO is just a very highly rated employee. The owners of the company, who are the shareholders, want to make money. They have put this guy in place to make money. Interesting thing about Friedman's argument is that he doesn't think there should be any of this social corporate responsibility type thing where a company will invest in like schools or they'll give donations and things of that nature. He makes the argument that that's not the job of a company. Company is to make money, and you should make money and then you should pass that money on to the owners, and if the owners want to build a school or something, they're free to do it, but it's not the function of a company to do it. So it's basically to say that shareholders have many, many different interests. In public companies there can be many different shareholders, but a common interest of them all will be making money. So it's easier for you, or better for you, to just make money, give it to them, and then they can do all the other stuff they want to do, rather than an argument being put forward that the company should go into all of these non-profit making areas because particular shareholders are interested in it. You just make your money, give it to them, and that's the job. And the CEO is much just a straight employee as the cashier at McDonald's. And there's actually there's a quick point I want to make here about the nature of boards of directors. So the board are themselves also they also have oversight over them. Now, there are many companies in which the boards, they get voted in basically as custom. There's no real opposition to them. But we're starting to see more sort of activist shareholders who are actively pushing boards to make certain changes, which is at least an interesting development. There are other theories, like a stakeholder theory, that posit the view of that corporate social responsibility is actually necessary. And then there are arguments from shareholder theory that you should actually have corporate social responsibility, not because you give a shit about it, but because the public do. And capitalism and capitalist markets represent the public. So whenever there's a thing like a company just rapes some third world country in order to produce something for a fractional amount cheaper, they do that because that reflects the desires of consumers. Consumers care more about the cheaper product than they do about the negatives that the company did to achieve that. In a society in which consumers actually care about things like, let's say, the environment or human rights, companies will, by and large, not do things that are violations of human rights or that harm the environment. Or if they do, they will desperately try and hide it, because that will cost them market share. I think this is a lot of reason why people don't like capitalist systems, because people talk a lot about caring about these things, but then when you actually look at their actions and their purchasing patterns, most people don't. I mean, some people do. There are some people who go to a great extent to source ethically sourced goods and things of that nature. But a lot of the time, even when the option is available to people, they won't take it because that option tends to be more expensive. And people tend to say things about capitalism that it's cruel and unkind and those things. But it's only cruel and unkind to the extent that the consumer base is cruel and unkind. It is an absolutely amoral system of exchange. It will reflect the parties involved in it. So there are other theories. This is a lot easier in privately owned companies or companies in which there are only a small number of large shareholders. Because in those instances, it's very easy for the company, for the shareholders who are the owners, to decide that they don't actually care about profit maximization over other things. And you're starting to see the emergence of funds which will buy shares in a company and will push for changes that are very clearly not profit maximizing changes. So these could be funds that will seek to force divestment from certain areas, or will seek to have companies adopt certain policies that are environmentally friendly or good for human rights or the third world or whatever you're having, but don't help the company make money, and in some cases may actually be contrary to the company making money. Personally, I'm of the view that it's perfectly acceptable for a company to engage in activity which is not directed at maximizing profit, so long as that is the will of the owners. It's a lot easier in smaller companies and in private companies because you can just ask the owners directly, whereas in larger publicly traded companies it would be basically impossible to get a consensus on what the company should be doing other than profit, at least a consensus which is fair to all owners. And so in that sense, yeah, it absolutely makes sense to focus on profit maximization. But again, most companies don't focus on profit maximization. There is also an interesting point here about CEOs in that when people talk about them, they're generally talking about the top level of CEOs, sort of Fortune 500 companies. But there are CEOs in companies of all sizes, from companies that have 2 employees to companies that have tens of thousands of employees. So CEO pay can go from basically 1-to-1 with staff, or it can go hundreds of times above. You generally don't see thousands of times, but you might see about 300 to 1. So if you're in a Fortune 500 company, which tend to be the largest publicly traded companies in the world, and you're a CEO, you can expect to be paid somewhere in the region of sort of 11 to 13 million would be an average. Now, there are people who earn less than that. There are people who earn substantially more than that. But they don't get that all in cash. In fact, most of them will get very little of that in cash. For reasons that are actually quite odd. And we can blame on the Americans. So if you were a CEO, you'll probably get about, if you get any cash component, it'll probably be about $1 million at max. And why that is in 1993, the American Congress said that if corporations want to pay executive pay over 1 million, they have to show it's based on some metric of the performance of the company. It has to be performance-related pay. The problem there is that, well, depends on if you see the problem, the easiest way to look at performance is share price. So CEOs are largely now, they will get most of their compensation through stock options, through stock in the company. If the value of the company goes up, then they will make more money. So you get to about 1993, and then CEO pay just starts going up massively. Now, it had been much higher than average pay, but once it got strongly linked to stock options, it just went mental. So that was actually an attempt to limit CEOs' pay. I say, well, why are they paid so much to begin with? And there are a couple of reasons. The first is that when you're talking about CEOs on that kind of wage, you were talking about people who are leading vast entities. I mean, you could be talking about companies that would have billions in revenue. And so relative to that, their pay actually doesn't seem that disproportionate, at least to the company. You also have the fact that generally boards place a very high value on CEOs. And because CEOs are the people who are responsible ultimately for the performance of the company, including a lot of the strategic level decisions, although the board will set some, they bear a great deal of responsibility. It's a lot of pressure. When you look at how CEOs, how they work significantly more than the average person. They spend a lot more of their free time working. They have much less work-life balance. There's also been some interesting research on how many of them there are. So there was a study in 2017 in the from the Stanford Business School, and it was called CEO Talent, a Dime a Dozen, or Worth Its Weight in Gold. And that basically just surveyed boards of directors to see what they thought about CEOs. And what came out of that was on average, the board of directors, when asked how many people could do the CEO's job if they had to replace their current CEO, said 4. As in, there are 4 people in the world, other than the person currently doing it, who can do the job to the standard the current guy is. And if you have a company that has revenue in the billions, and you think if you don't get one of these 4 people, the company is going to suffer, well then that puts quite a value on getting that person on board. And if that requires, $1 million in cash and then 10 million in performance-related pay, whether it's bonuses or stock options, well then you'll do that. And most boards from the survey I've seen consider stock options a positive in that it incentivizes you to care about the value of the company, because if the value of the company goes down, you're out money. Sometimes significant amounts of money. Now, there is actually a strong argument here that by paying CEOs so much in stock options, they've incentivized a very strange way of thinking about companies, which is divorced from what could actually be good for the company, rather than what is perceived as being good for the company by the stock markets. There's also the research on whether or not an individual CEO actually has a large impact on a company is interesting. They usually do have a large impact, but it's very difficult to actually figure out how large an impact and how much of a success or failure is actually due to a single player. It's sort of like analysing sports teams, and there's actually quite a lot about this area that is similar to sports teams. CEOs would be, the star player, the guy you're just going to throw money at to get on the team because you've convinced yourself if you get him on the team, you'll be flying. And that can be true if you've got the infrastructure in place and the rest of the team is of a standard where that works. Or you could bring on a star player and it turns out there's deep dysfunction in your team that one player may or may not be able to fix, but it's not going to be a pleasant experience for anyone involved. But similarly, when you analyse teams, it can be quite difficult to say, well, this is the guy who makes us win games, because it might not be the guy who scores, it may not be anyone you'd notice, it may be someone who's just very good at getting other people lined up to score. I mean, in large companies, there are infinite amount of the C-suite, which is just a reference to people like CEOs, Chief Executive Officer, CTO, Chief Technical Officer, dozens of them. But the C-suite is just the upper level of a company, those who have a C in their title, and generally there is no one above them in relation to their area. So you'll have people over finance, you'll have people over technology, you'll have people over day-to-day management, depending on the type of company you're in. And then above all of them, you'll have the CEO. So this I think, harkens back to a point I made earlier. I think it is fair to pay CEOs extortionate wages. Never said that was the best option to do. In fact, most of the CEOs I know, there is this general idea that we have to pay these people grotesque amounts of money or they won't work as hard. Most of the people I know who are involved at this level, I would say once they're involved, regardless of the amount you're paying them, they're going to work roughly as hard. So why is it fair for these companies to pay CEOs these kind of sums? It's fair for the basic reason that a company is someone's property. People own a company, and you hire people to take care of your property. At the end of the day, the CEO is not an owner of the company, unless they have stock options or they were involved at a previous stage, but they don't have to be. And so the owners of the company have an absolute right to do what they want with it. They can sell the company, they can shut it down, they can expand, they can do whatever they want with it relative to the resources they have. So if the company decides we are going to pay the average worker X, and we are going to pay the CEO Y, and Y is 2,000 times X, that's their choice. Now, you could make a strong argument that that is not the best usage of resources, but it is perfectly fair for a person to use the resources they own to give another person any amount of money. Now, in general, I would suspect that it would be better for a company to have higher levels of average pay amongst its workforce and lower CEO pay. But there's the thing, if you have, let's say your average employee is paid 30,000 and you have 20,000 employees and the CEO is paid 13 million. That's about 450 times the average wage. But there are 20,000 employees. So if you were to take the actual total wage bill of that company will spend, now this is a very simplified calculation because we're not including taxes or anything like that, we're assuming 30,000 is just everything that it costs to employ one person. With 20,000 employees, you will have a wage bill of roughly $600 million, or euro, depending on how you want to do this, which is to say that the CEO's actual remuneration as a percentage of that is minute. And that's one of the reasons that it can be so easy for boards to allow these kind of payments, is because you put someone over an entity of that size, then yeah, it's actually a relatively small amount. And if you have 20,000 employees, you can probably replace many of those employees pretty easily. If a board thinks there are only 4 people in the world who can replace their CEO, and the company is worth billions, and it has that many employees, it becomes very, very easy to justify a pay scale of this nature. In fact, I mean, that's why you see CEOs who don't get 13 million, they get 65 million, or they'll go above that. And you might say, well, how many companies actually have 20,000 employees? Well, when we're talking about CEOs earning around 13 million in remuneration, we're talking about Fortune 500 companies. Fortune 500 companies will have... Now, these figures are actually quite difficult to pin down, and they change fairly regularly. But you're generally looking at about 40 to 50,000 employees. Which is to say, it's not 20,000, it's in fact more. And their average wages do not tend to be 30,000, they tend to be higher. So you actually have a situation in which the CEO's wage may not even be 1% of the total wage bill. But they have responsibility for all 50,000 or 40,000 employees, and they will be blamed for issues that don't work. Which is a point that's not brought up a lot. Generally, in employment context, you get paid for the responsibility you take on. Even in situations in which you are not the person to blame for things going wrong. If you're the CEO of an entity of 50,000 employees, things can go wrong that are absolutely not your fault. They're not related to you in any way, and you will be blamed and potentially sacked for them. Conversely, things can go incredibly right that you had absolutely no hand in, and you will be rewarded for them, but that is the trade, and I have generally found most people do not like that level of responsibility. They like being able to go home and not think about work again. That's not going to happen at this level. But this is all really just sort of window dressing for the actual argument of why they should be able to pay them like this. They should be able to pay them because the owners decide what they want to do with their property, and the company is their property. In the same way that you can decide you want to lend your car to someone, or you want to leave more in your will to one person than the other. Or if you have children and you're paying them for chores, you can give one child more than the other. That's probably not a recipe for a happy home, particularly if you do it at the level of 300 to 1, but you could do it. It's your money. You have every right to do it. You can donate to anything you want. You can spend on whatever you want. No one can stop you. It's your money. And all we see with CEOs is the same thing. Now, if you were to ask me, is it right for them to do that? I don't think it's a moral question at all. And largely, I don't think it's one of fairness. I don't think pay inequality is actually important. I don't really get the focus on it. I think there are much better uses for money than CEO remuneration. In general, I think in large part most CEOs are not that beneficial to a company, at least from the performance I've seen of a lot of them, both personally and through study. But there are certain CEOs who are in fact that good, and if you can use remuneration to get those people to you, then you'll do it. I mean, a big part of this is actually people have this idea that large corporations are eternal. But it's actually quite interesting. If you look at the Fortune 500 in 1955, this is from research from the American Enterprise Institute. If you look at them from 1955 and then in 2016, only 12% of the corporation and corporate entities that were on it in 1955 are on it in 2016. The largest companies in the world tend to actually change and fall quite often. So there is always a fear of kind of falling. The currently ranked number one company on the Fortune 500, which again is the largest 500 companies in America, is Walmart. Walmart has 2.2 million employees. It also has revenue of 500 billion, which, if you can get it, is pretty solid. Now, Walmart is in a area which has really tight margins, so their profit is only at 6.6 or 6.7 billion. But then, you start walking to people like Amazon. Amazon has 647,500 employees. IBM, 381,100. Even General Electric has 280,000 people working for it. So all of these entities that pay these kind of massive wages that you hear about, yes, on average 50,000, but when you start getting up to the higher levels, and at this level you are talking about remuneration well past 13 million. So, for instance, Walmart, their CEO is called Doug McMillon. Doug McMillon took home 24 million last year, which sounds like an exceptional amount of money. But again, Walmart has 514 billion in revenue and 2.2 million employees. So even if you took all of McMillon's pay and you spread it out equally across all of Walmart's employees, they would each receive, what, $12? So, $12 for every person you're responsible for in Walmart? Is that even minimum wage in some states? $12 a year. So yes, that is my argument. Companies should be free to do this because they are private property, and private property can be used as the owners determine it should be used. A company that has a CEO who is capable of working at the top level but is not taking that amount of money will be more efficient than one that has a CEO taking a massive amount of remuneration. But as we found with Walmart, it's such a minute part of their actual revenue and their costs that the difference is really quite underwhelming. And actually, I just want to close out on a point I mentioned where I said that I don't think pay inequality is actually important. And I just wanted to make that point. I'm generally of the view that it doesn't matter what other people are being paid, it matters what you are being paid. And if you are being paid a fair wage, and while people don't like to hear it, there are absolutely jobs where the fair wage is 24,000, and there are absolutely jobs where the fair wage is 65 million. Sorry, fair remuneration. But anyway, this has been Gary Kavanagh here on the right side. As I said, without Michael Dwyer. If anyone has any comments on that, if you think it's a grotesque mockery of humanity, or if you think CEOs should be paid more, please do comment on social media. And anything you send on, I will see, or I will be sent. And other than that, we will see you on Wednesday. All the best.